The biggest story to come out of Scotland or the UK in more than 300 years is being almost totally ignored by the British mainstream media. Not a single mention on any of Britain's news channels, hardly a word in any UK newspaper. Yet this story is so huge it should be front page news and the lead item on news bulletins across Britain and the world. Instead, it's been spiked. So, what is this story and why is it being hidden from the wider public? Keep watching to find out. But before we start, like and share this video and subscribe to the Scotland channel on YouTube. Don't forget to hit that notification bell for more great content from the Scotland channel. A liberation group has made a shock announcement that is set to rock the United Kingdom to its very foundations and bring about the end of England's 318-year union with Scotland. The group called Liberation Scotland has announced that it is starting the process of decolonising Scotland at the United Nations. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has been formally notified of Liberation Scotland's intentions to have Scotland decolonised as a non-self-governing territory, and a team from the group are heading to New York in the next few weeks to meet diplomats from more than 30 countries. Mike Fennick and Dave Llewellyn ran an independence podcast, Twa Auld Heeds, until around 4 years ago, but have reunited to interview some of the key figures involved in this bid to have Scotland added to the list of 18 territories to be considered for decolonisation. The Scotland channel teamed up with Mike and Dave at Dunfermline's Carnegie Conference Centre on Saturday, May 17, 2025, as they interviewed some of the key figures in this historic challenge to the UK state. Their first guest was Sharof Azizov of Geneva-based Justice for All International, which is taking the case to the United Nations on behalf of Liberation Scotland.
You represent an organisation called Justice for All International. Forgive me, I can't do it in French. Could you give us background to what that organisation is, does, and your own role within it, please?
Yes, I'm representing association called Justice for All International. I'm executive director. Our association is a human rights association, and we are actively engaged at the United Nations representing individuals, people who actually suffer human rights violations. And we file individual complaints, and based on individual complaints, we also organize advocacy to bring those people human rights violations to the attention of the United Nations. I'm a human rights lawyer. I have almost 30 years of experience in the human rights field. I have a decade of experience at the UN, and I have a decade of experience serving different international missions, field missions in Balkans, South Caucasus. So I'm very happy and proud to represent Liberation of Scotland at the UN, and hope we will take the efforts of Scotland liberation to the new level at the United Nations, at those specific structures and mechanisms that exist to help people to get out of colonial suffering.
Could you maybe tell us a little about the route that you would see us taking?
So the route that we are offering, in fact, is pretty much very well structured. This is, we call it UN process. So UN created a process for decolonization quite some time ago, and this process involved so-called Fourth Committee. That is the main committee one of the main committees of the General Assembly of the United Nations that consider and look and adopt resolutions regarding the situations in non-self-governed territories that deserve to gain independence. And this committee has a specialized committee, which is called C24. And C24 committee is rather subsidiary arrangement that been created to support FOSS committee and the General Assembly to look specifically at non-self-governing territories. At the moment, there are 17 officially recognized and listed for decolonization non-self-governed territories that are in the agenda of consideration by the C24 committee. So our goal is to bring Scotland liberation to the agenda of this C24 at the first place, and we also need to make sure that Scotland is also listed in the UN list for decolonization. So it means that in addition to those 17 non-self-governed territories, there should be one more added. So hopefully Scotland will become 18. 18 very soon.
It's obviously a process that has to be gone through. In my brain, I see it as soft power to some extent, where you're actually engaging with the countries on the C24 committee, but there's then a structure that they will want to work to. How will that process proceed? It won't be immediate what you're trying to do. So what will be the steps that you'll try to achieve in getting Scotland's liberation forward?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing what you have to understand is that UN process is always a complementary. So what we are doing, we are trying to put as much efforts as possible to make this complementary process at the UN to help people in Scotland to determine their own future. So the future, in fact, is in the hands of people of Scotland, not in the hands of UN or UN officials or the delegations at the UN. Yeah? And our role is actually to create necessary conditions within this complementary process so that people in Scotland are empowered and they have real opportunity and effective conditions to realize their future, to determine their own future. And of course, for that, you can call it soft power, you can call it strong power, depends, you know, of perspective, I guess. But what is important to realize, the process is very complicated. It involves not just legal thinking and bringing the different legal concepts together to well justify that indeed the situation in Scotland perfectly fits within UN resolutions that actually govern the process as such, and also determination whether non-self-governing territories are eligible to be listed as such for decolonization at the UN. It also takes a lot of political effort. I mean, it's a political process. UN is a combination of legal and political processes. So as such, of course, it would take a lot of efforts for advocacy. And the process may not be so short and quick because UN is, as it exists now and it functions now, quite a long process to accomplish any initiatives that you would like to bring to come to the final point. But the process is, I think, very promising. And as it is complementary, whatever achievements within this process we would be gaining, it will definitely and strongly complement and help Scottish people to move their own agenda and their own efforts to gain independence as soon as possible. So we are here to help and to support. And of course, we will try to make this process as smooth as possible and as quick as possible, but it will take time.
With the UK being on the Security Council, is there any possibility that they can just veto this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. The thing is, our process does not involve Security Council. So we are, in a way, we are passing by Security Council. UN is a complex machinery. So main UN body is, yeah, indeed, it's Security Council, but then there is a General Assembly. So our path is, in fact, is through the committees and the specialized committees which are created within the General Assembly construct. Yeah. And we are using those processes which never ever actually have any influence of the veto power of the Security Council states. Yeah. So in this sense, I think you have to recognize and you have to understand that the UK has exactly the same level of power at the General Assembly based on the principle of equality of the states, or member states of the United Nations, as anyone else in the General Assembly. The same for the work of the committees, within the committees and the specialized committees. For General Assembly resolution, you have to have force committee to design and draft this resolution. The resolution comes from C24 in any case, yeah, because they have final say to say, you know, whether this falls under the criteria which been used to determine whether the non-self-governing territory deserve to be listed or not. And but for all this, what actually it takes is to have one country, one single country, member of the United Nations, to vouch and say for this, to vouch for this non-self-governing territory and say we want this territory to be considered for being listed. Yeah. Yeah, and then the entire process would actually trigger and start and will continue. It pass to the General Assembly resolution, which cannot be vetoed at all. The vicious circle, in fact, that if you want to be heard by C24, you have to have a resolution. If you want to have a resolution, you have to have C24 to listen and to know your situation and to vouch as well, you know, to say, yeah, indeed, this non-self-governing territory deserves to be listed. So all this we have to bring together in a way that through our advocacy, we need to find at least one country that would agree with our legal arguments, with concerns that we raise, and with desire and wish of people of Scotland to be independent.
Sarah Salyers of Salvo, the campaigning arm of Liberation Scotland and author of Doon Hodden, Professor Alf Baird, also took time out of the conference to speak about the historic developments announced at the event.
When I've read your book and I'm looking at the cultural imposition of British ideas, I always think of one exception to it. I'd like to test you on it, which is, excuse me, which is the Tartan Army. You've got different tribes who compose that, and they are one of the biggest cultural ambassadors that we actually have at the moment. They go abroad and introduce Scotland, I'll say, and their happiness and their singing and their get-together and their camaraderie. And that is a complete break from anything that I would see as colonialism. Can I test you on that, please?
Yeah, well, cultural assimilation fails, according to the theory, because it succeeded in few occasions. Like the Scottish gentry became English in mannerisms and all the other aspects of beliefs and so on. But in general, cultural assimilation fails because national consciousness is difficult to destroy in many cases, especially if the language and the culture continues. And what you're talking about, the Tartan Army, is national consciousness. Scottish marches are national consciousness. And an independence movement depends on national consciousness, which has two basic elements: is the culture and language of the people, which I would say is the Scots language mainly, because it's the Scots language most of us speak every day in the schools and their house and their work or whatever. So that lingers on it, and that is the basis of the independence movement. We have to remember also that colonialism is at root racist. Scotland has been under colonial rule for now 3 centuries, and it's racism because it subordinates the native culture and language, and issues stereotypes about that as well. The Scottish cultural cringe, we have that, and it raises above them another culture, another language, a dominant language, and this is cultural imperialism, and what we call also linguistic imperialism. So these are colonial procedures that the colonial powers implemented everywhere. Even the Russians had the Russianization policy, and so on. So it's done. Colonialism is fundamentally about economic exploitation, political control, and as Sarah said, annexation of territories. But it's done psychologically, and it's done culturally and linguistically, and that's what we have to understand. And also, when countries decolonize, they might decolonize constitutionally, but they also have to decolonize culturally and psychologically. Memi, Fanon, all the rest, psychologists behind this, talking about decolonizing of the mind. And if in some cases of decolonization, where you might have decolonization and independence, but the people retain a colonial mindset.
That's why I raised the question, and I used Australia, Canada as examples, because often these countries still retain a certain flag as part of their flag.
Yes.
And that is obviously a sign that the psychology is still there.
Well,
There's still some reserve psychology.
What we also have to remember with colonialism, it's always a cooperative venture with native elites. And we see this in Scotland in great measure, even going back to 1603, where you had the Union of the Crowns, the elites, the aristocracy, sent their kids to be educated in England and to become basically English. So you had this mismatch within our society. But yeah, it's very important to regard to think about colonialism in these ways, because you can be independent but still not be independent of mind.
It's also a class thing, because it's always and in every case a cooperative venture between the colonizer, the administering power, what they call it, and the native population, indigenous people. So you have those who are educated in the superior culture, and they speak English rather in the way that I do, and they can take positions of influence, and they can prosper and thrive as long as they're part of the colonizing venture. And those who don't divide more and more, are divided more and more from the cooperators, the ones who want to benefit. And I have a family story about that I'll tell some other time. But my gran was not allowed to speak Gaelic. Her parents spoke it, but she wasn't allowed to. And when her grandmother explained to her why, she mourned that to the day she died, that she didn't speak Gaelic. But her grandmother told her, among other things, one was fear, and because my great-great-grandmother, she and those who had been shut up in their homes and burned, they'd been heard speaking Gaelic. And you won't find that in history. But the other was that they wanted her to prosper. Her parents wanted her not to be part of, we talk about the Scottish Queen, not to be part of this now not self-loathing, but self-deprecating population that was inferior. They wanted her to join the superior, group and be able to do well. And speaking Gaelic, that marked you as inferior. It's desperately sad. That's how colonization works. And that's this division that you have. And it's a division today, by the way.
So asking you. There's an announcement going to be made this afternoon. 2 years ago, when Charles came up to Edinburgh, we're trying to take out an interdict to stop the Church of Scotland taking part in the thing.
Yeah.
And we ran all over the place trying to get a lawyer all up and down Scotland, and we couldn't get one anywhere. As I say, I know it's not official just yet, but it's going to be this afternoon. Would you like to tell us a little bit about where that came from?
Well, we finally have a KC, and one that many of us have admired for a long time, who has had a kind of road to Damascus moment where he looked at the case, setting out the fact that this union that was supposed to take this had not, and came back and said to his astonishment, we're right. And we've had quite a few conversations about why, to me, it's the dead elephant in the room. That this treaty had never come into operation. But why has that not been obvious to everybody else? But for whatever reason, it hasn't. From Lord Cooper, to the Lord Advocate in October 2022, as we know the two kingdoms of England and Scotland were extinguished and the United Kingdom came into being. Simply accepted all this time, and it has never been true. And I'm very confident and hopeful that this is the beginning of the dam breaking.
The Scottish establishment has been assimilated into the colonial system by which Scotland is administered, for all the reasons previously outlined by Professor Alf Baird and Sarah Salyers. So the announcement that top Scottish advocate Robert Black KC has agreed to become part of the Liberation Scotland team after studying the case they are putting forward to the United Nations represents a considerable milestone for the group.
Can you give us some background to your experience in matters that are going to be under discussion later on today?
I, for my 60 years involvement in the law, have tended to believe what has become the orthodoxy about the constitution of the country we live in. And that is that what happened in 1707 was that two independent states in international law both ceased to exist, and a new state, an absolutely new state, called Great Britain, came into existence. Now that is the version of what happened in 1707 and thereby. That has been accepted by constitutional lawyers, by international lawyers, and by Scottish lawyers for generations. And it is what I believed implicitly until less than a year ago. And less than a year ago, I was encouraged by Sarah Salyers and others just to have a look at what the situation actually was. Like most lawyers, I tend to look at the documentation. And it's the documentation that tends to inform your opinion of what legally happened. But if you look beyond the documentation to what actually happened to the institutions of government in Scotland and in England, then you pretty rapidly come to the conclusion that while Scotland ceased to exist as a state in international law, its institutions of government, legislature, executive, and to a certain extent, judicial branch of government, all of these ceased to exist or were completely transformed. When you look, however, at what happened to England at the same time, the conclusion you come to is that nothing changed. The institutions of government of England, Parliament, executive government, court structure, nothing changed at all, except that the territorial extent of their authority was increased to embrace also Scotland. When one looks not simply at the documentation, but at what actually happened in consequence of the documentation, the conclusion is inevitable that one country ceased to exist. The other country did not, but for cosmetic reasons, changed its name and increased its territorial extent. That is a conclusion that I was extremely reluctant to come to. It ran counter to everything that I had believed for the 59 years in which I had been involved in one capacity or another in the law. But it's a conclusion that I have come to and which I have no doubt is the correct conclusion in law.
Going back to the ill-fated Supreme Court case of 2022, when our Lord Advocate basically went in and spouted the party line, as it were, that would extinguish ourselves. There were two things came out in that court case. One, that the Scottish Parliament or Scottish Government couldn't hold a referendum because Westminster was solved in. And the other one was that because of parliamentary sovereignty, which came from 1689. So, and the other one was that both parliaments had extinguished themselves. So you've got these two things that were both said in the same case. And yet, because you know yourself in legal, you have provenance. So if the English Parliament had ceased to exist, then parliamentary sovereignty would not have carried on to the greatest Britain Parliament.
Absolutely.
And so, well, I'd like your
Yes.
idea on
No, that is absolutely right. And that is what, in McCormick against the Lord Advocate, Lord Cooper was reaching towards. He never, in my view, actually got there, but he was on the road towards that particular point. And if an entirely new creature as a legislature came into being in 1707, then why assume automatically that it has all of the powers of the Parliament that it succeeded to? Why? It doesn't make sense. Parliamentary sovereignty makes sense under our Constitution only if what exists today is a continuation of what existed in England at that time. It otherwise makes no legal sense.
And yet the Supreme Court basically said both those things.
Absolutely. That's right. That's right. And I mean, it's perfectly possible to hold two contradictory views at the same time. Lawyers are actually quite good at that.
But it can't make both of them right.
It can't make both of them right. One of them, if they are contradictory, then one of them must be right, the other must be wrong, or both must be wrong. There is that alternative too.
One of the most common phrases known to everyone in legal circles and in the public is when a witness is asked to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I have formed my personal opinion that we've been lied to. I have also, following discussions with Alf Beard about colonialism, that we've also lied to ourselves. Is that broadly in line with your own thoughts of what's taken place in your judgment?
Yes, but I wouldn't necessarily think that, and I'm sure you're not suggesting, would be the sole explanation. I think a lot of lying took place, and I have to say, much of that lying did not take place in the early 18th century. If you look at the early 18th century, if you look at writers, both in Scotland and in England at that time, not all of them swallowed the idea that two countries both ceased to exist and a new country emerged like a phoenix out of the ashes. It's only really in the 19th century. In the 19th century, you find a new idea, a new consensus arising as to what happened. And the name that is always mentioned in this context is Professor A.V. Dicey. And Dicey's view of what happened at the time of the abolition of the Scottish Parliament and other Scottish institutions was precisely that English institutions also were abolished and something entirely new came into existence. Now, one can see the attraction of that even for Scotland, because for Scots lawyers who regard themselves as Scottish and not necessarily primarily as British, it is less damaging to one's self-esteem to say that not only our country ceased to exist, but the other lot's country ceased to exist as well. And we became partners, maybe junior partners, and badly treated partners, but it was a partnership. That is more comforting to one's self-esteem as a Scot than saying we actually were taken over by our southern neighbour. So that, I think, is the reason why. I mean, people like Professor T.B. Smith of Edinburgh University, David Walker of Glasgow University, Scottish legal nationalists, but that was the view that they took of what had happened. And I think that's the reason why they took it. It is more comforting to your self-esteem than to recognize that, you know, you gave up your status as a citizen of an independent country to become a colonial.
Our next guest, Craig Murray, was former British ambassador to Uzbekistan and is an author, blogger and human rights activist.
I want to start off with a thought. I am told, and I don't know whether it's true, that there is an art to diplomacy. Would you like to consider that and tell me whether it is true, and if it is true, what the art is?
I think it's partly a matter of negotiating skill. But I mean, there genuinely is an art to it. And I was in the Foreign Office for 22 years. And I negotiated, for example, most of the UK's continental shelf boundaries. I negotiated amendments to the Law of the Sea Convention, and I negotiated personally the treaty that ended the Sierra Leone war. And different people do things in different ways. But the factor which I think is generally not sufficiently understood is personal relationships. It really is a matter. It's extremely important to establish a personal relationship with the people you're negotiating with, and that they like you and trust you. Without that, it's very hard. I mean, of course, you have hard-headed interests of states which you're representing in an international negotiation, and they have to be met. And it's possible to enter negotiation and come to an agreement that meets those interests, despite the fact everybody actually hates each other. It is, but deals made in that way generally don't last very long. Establishing the trust of the people you're negotiating with, their personal goodwill, if you see, and getting them to actually like you, is enormously important. The final protocol to the Law of the Sea Convention, which enabled it to come into force, which was about deep sea bed mining of all things, we eventually hit on the final formula by basically four people, me representing the Western European group, and a guy called Satya Nandan, who was representing the Secretary General, and a guy called Dolliver Nelson, representing the developing states, another gentleman named Jesus from Portugal, I think. We finally came up with the wording for the last tricky clause, while standing in the shallow end of the swimming pool at the Pegasus Hotel in Montego Bay, sipping cocktails. And that was how we did it. And that really was where we finally came up with the final formula of the last tricky bit of a negotiation. And that's a true story. And the fact we all liked each other, and we'd all been to the cricket together the day before, that helps. I think, and there's one thing you never find. There are books written, and there are whole books written on the negotiations on the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they all miss those personal relationships. They all analyze it academically as to what was interest. Nobody really thinks that you win a negotiation by winning the trust and friendship of the people you're negotiating with.
Contact Liberation Scotland are now going to have with the UN. How much of that diplomacy and what you've just mentioned about personal relations will play its part?
Well, very much so, I think. It's amazing how much is discretionary. And I've always been at pains to say to people, you have to have a foolproof case. You have to have a good case. You have to have a case that stands up technically. But it's not a court. You're not winning a legal judgment. Having a good case is not enough in its own. You have to persuade the committee secretariat and the chairman of the committee to allow it onto the agenda in the first place, for example. And there's an area of discretion there. You have to persuade delegates of states to support you. It's vital there to actually start, you have to become friendly with the secretariat and helpful to them. And to do that, you have to have established a relationship that isn't only about the thing you want. So, for example, we're planning to go to the UN and speak on New Caledonia, which is a lovely coincidence, but to go and speak about the right to self-determination of New Caledonia, which the French are trying to deny. So we want to go there and play a positive role and assist the Secretariat and assist the committee and be seen as doing good things for New Caledonia as a way in, if you like, as a way of starting those relationships. And then you start talking to them about Old Caledonia too. So yes, it is key. And of course, not only with missions in New York and Geneva to the United Nations, they report back to their capitals. And having, once you've got to that stage where they've reported back and said, we think this is interesting, we think we should look at pursuing that, we then need to build relationships in the capitals as well. Now we have a huge well of experience and expertise in Scotland. Scottish people have always worked abroad. That's actually partly one of the effects of colonisation and one of the effects of the fact that our own economy has been eaten out and shattered by being colonised. People have had to go and work abroad to make a living. But because of that, we have people, there's almost every country in the world where we can quite easily find somebody who knows senior people in that country and has expertise in that country. And that's where we need to rely on not, our present diaspora and our people in Scotland who have been part of the diaspora to help us to find ways in to different governments. But that's all very doable. And I'm saying to people, this is a process. It's not immediate, but it's a process of 2-3 years. It's not a process of 10-20 years. As long as we get going on it and are really, really serious about it, and we have enough people truly committed to doing it.
I sat in your house with you 2 years ago doing an interview, and at the time you brought up the fact that getting standing at the UN, and you mentioned for the first time the liberation movement. At the time, could you look forward 2 years and see us sitting here today with what's going to be happening this afternoon and what's going to be happening over the next couple of weeks when we sat in your house that day?
Yeah, I remember that conversation very well, where I was explaining the liberation movement route at the UN, and at the time, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I was explaining partly as an academic exercise. I was thinking through, how would you do this? Well, what do you do? What are you going to do? And then you get acknowledged as a liberation movement, and then you get to the... And so I wouldn't say, I think making it up as I went along would be a bit to downplay it. But I was thinking it through as we spoke, and it has now advanced far further than I thought. But I don't want to take credit for that at all, because the work of many people in Salvo and in Liberate Scotland has been extraordinary. And in a way, particularly on the research side, I'm piggybacking. There are too many people to mention them all. But I should mention, of course, Ssrg and Alf Beard and his work on post-colonial studies and on getting you have to have as your command, particularly for a diplomat who's doing the negotiating, you need to have at your command the correct terminology and the correct jargon for the field. I was saying that I negotiated treaties in international maritime law, for example. You need to know the terms. You need to know the terms because, of course, language constrains your way of thinking. When you're talking to an expert, if they think along the lines of what is meant by certain jargon terms, you have to be able to guide their thinking along that way. And that's where I think the work of Alf Beard, in particular on post-colonial studies and on markers of colonialism, because this is the way the UN Committee thinks, and this is the way the experts who advise the UN Committee think. So you have to be in the right area, speaking the right words, using the right vocabulary and jargon.
One of the things that I think may prove important in this, and I'm hoping maybe you had contact in your past with them, all of the people who gained their independence as colonies from the UK have something very important, which is called learned experience. Yeah. They know exactly where we're trying to get, and they will understand and identify with a lot of the stuff that Alf Beard has pointed out. Do you have any past contacts with some of those colonies that you may find it easier to get into?
Well, very much so, yeah. Particularly in the Caribbean colonies and in Africa, especially West Africa. And I was also, I'm not quite sure how I managed to pack so much into my foreign officer career, but I was also the deputy head of the African department at one stage. So, and I lived in both Nigeria and Ghana. I served in both countries. So I've got very good contacts in those countries. And yes, that's one thing which we're going to be looking to do. We're going to be looking to gain support from the ex-colonial countries of the global south. One of the difficulties with this is it's not as difficult as it may sound, but one of the difficulties with this is persuading them to see us as fellow colonized, not as their colonizers. That, as I say, is less hard than it sounds, because there's a greater understanding of the Scottish position than you may expect. And nobody has any difficulty at all with the notion that the Irish were colonized. And if you put it in that perspective, then it's easier for Scotland. And also there's I mean, let's be open about this. People may laugh at it, but Braveheart actually did a huge amount of good in explaining the colonization of Scotland, even in its earliest stages, to the world. There's a fundamental understanding about narrative on a popular level, which is important. And by and large, Scots are just popular overseas.
One of my hopes, Craig, and you can maybe respond to this, is that South Africa in particular, with its knowledge of what it was like to be denied the right to vote, that Glasgow gave the freedom of the city of Glasgow to Nelson Mandela whilst he was still in prison, leads on to a natural dialogue if we're saying, look, we have problems over the right to vote in Scotland.
Yeah.
Whether we're yes or whether you're no. At the current moment, the UK government says no one can have the right to vote on the future of the country. That cannot be right. And I think they would identify with that. Yeah.
I mean, South Africa is obviously one of the countries we're particularly going to be looking to for support. I've got a few countries in my head where I'm going to start, if you like. South Africa is one, Venezuela is one, Trinidad is one. I've actually been working with South Africa on the genocide case in The Hague. Unfortunately, they've just recently had a change of foreign minister because that was a relationship I'd established and I need to re-establish. But it's not to change a party or anything, just to change a person. But yeah, I mean, South Africa is a country from which I expect support. Malawi is another one which has had very, very close links with Scotland, where we might hope to get to get support. Venezuela is my real starting place. Where countries which are extremely hot on the anti-colonialist narrative, and countries which are particularly upset about British support for Israel. You know, those are places where we have a natural well of understanding and where we can expect to get immediate sympathy.
So, is this going to be your second diplomatic career? But now you will be a diplomat, sorry, an ambassador for Liberation Scotland.
It's going to be. I'm looking forward to it enormously. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the last couple of years interacting with the UN for the case. Well, partly on Palestine, I've been doing that, and also on the case of Julian Assange. So I've actually spent quite a lot of time at UN committees and around the UN for the last couple of years. Anyway, so I hadn't sort of completely given up on it in a sense, but this is. You know, obviously, unless there's something wrong with you, the freedom of your own country means more to you than any other cause.